So in this video I'll be showing you how to make this, using only scrap metal from previous projects, and you can do the same with your scrap metal. So this whole process is going to be more of an art than a science, seeing that none of these pieces are ever meant to go together, and they're all from different projects and all different shapes. So I'm just going to look for copper and brass and see what shapes I have left over that look nice and might go together well. This is going to be completely different for you, seeing that you make different things than I do. The only pattern I'll be using for this is a heart shape, and I know that I want it to be a mended heart, so it'll be all sewn up. Other than that, I'm just going to kind of go with the flow with all the pieces I find and see what looks good together and what I can use. Once I've picked all my pieces out, I'm going to lay them out, and then I'm going to use my heart pattern as a reference and a guide to see where things would line up with one another and how much area it's going to take. So I decided to use this bigger piece of copper for the center part of my heart and then build out from it. I'm going to want to cut it down a bit so I don't have to heat this whole piece when I solder everything, and so I have less metal to work with. For now I'm just going to mark where I need to cut it and then put an X on the piece that I need to cut off. So now I need to fill out this area so I can actually cut this out in a heart shape, and I'm going to try to use brass for the outside pieces so they can contrast with the center and it doesn't look like just all one piece. So this piece kind of lines up with it, and it just needs a small bit of it cut off, and it'll leave a nice little hole in the center that I can work with later and maybe fill it in with something else. So I'm just going to trim down both pieces and see how well they fit together and test it with the pattern to make sure that it's going to cover the entire area of the pattern, or at least most of it. So I found this cool looking textured piece of brass, and I thought this would look good on the other side of the heart. It almost matches the curvature of the center copper piece, so I don't have to modify it too much or the copper piece, but I'm going to have to get him a little bit closer. So I'm going to mark a piece on the copper and just cut it off. So this bottom plate is looking like it's going to line up how I want it to, and I can get to the soldering part, or at least the first part of the soldering. So I'm going to just set everything how I want it on my flat soldering surface, and put some flux all over it and make sure to get it between the joints as much as possible, and place a couple little pieces of hard silver solder on the joints. So to heat my pieces up, I'm going to be using my Smith's little torch and a solder pick to make sure my solder goes in the correct places. Seeing that these joints aren't perfect and there are little gaps between them will make it so the solder will not flow completely through it. So if I need to move the solder around a bit or off of a piece to another piece, I can do it with the solder pick. So once all that is done, I have to heat up the piece a little bit more with a propane torch to get it off of the soldering area, and I'm going to quench it in some water. After that I'm going to dry it off and then stick my heart-shaped pattern onto it and start cutting it out. Since I don't need it to be clean to do this, I'm just going to do it right now and then pickle the piece to remove all the fire scale. Since we heated this piece, it is now annealed, which means it's really soft and it bends really easily, so you have to be very careful when using your saw and make sure it's supported evenly, or as much as possible, so you don't bend the piece and break your blade. At one point in this I actually did break my blade and had to replace it. So I'm going to remove as much of the pattern as I can, and then I'm going to use a center punch to mark where I'm going to drill holes through this piece to make a sewn pattern. And then I'm going to drill each one of them out. Once I'm done with all that, I can finally put this into the pickling solution and get it all cleaned up. Once it comes out of the pickling solution and I dried it all off, I'm going to take a sanding disc to it and clean it up a little bit more so I can see exactly how everything's going to look, and so I can start putting pieces on top of it from my scrap metal to see what would look good on it. I'm also going to be trying to get a lot of the solder off. I don't really mind if it shows because this is a rougher looking piece and it kind of goes with it, but I want to get some of the bigger spots off. So I found this piece of scrap metal that has gears cut out of it, so I'm going to use them around the top curve of the heart, and I think that will actually go really well with it. And to get the proper shape, all I have to do is put the piece over the top of it and use my scribing tool and trace around it, and then I can just cut it out with a jeweler saw and it should match up perfectly. Once it's all cut out, I'm going to use a hand file and go along the outside edge of this to make sure it's all smooth and there's no jagged edges or any sharp spots, and then test fit it onto the heart itself. It had a couple spots that covered up the holes I drilled, so I'm going to use the scribe tool and draw little outlines around them and just cut those out with the jeweler saw and then test fit it again. As you can tell, this whole process has more of an organic flow to it than me actually measuring things and making sure all the math lines up properly. And there we go, both of the holes are now exposed and how I wanted them to be. And I happen to also find a piece of copper that has a similar pattern to this, so I'm going to use that on the opposite side and use the same technique as before, which is just put this piece on top of it and then trace it and cut it out with the jeweler saw. After test fitting everything again, it looks like one of the top holes was blocked, so I'll just cut that piece off also. With all that done, I just found a interesting looking piece of brass and cut it off, and I'm going to be putting that on the bottom piece right here, and it almost lines up with the shape of the heart. For the middle piece of this that's missing, I wanted it to be like a floating piece, so it would only be held in with the metal wire that is going to be sewing the heart back together. Once I had it all cut out, I wanted it to have a pattern or a texture on it, so I used the hammer to do so. But this makes the piece change its shape and spread out a little bit, so I'm going to have to file down the sides to make sure it fits. Once the piece fit inside of it again, I needed to use the center punch to mark where I'm going to put my holes, and then drill them out. Before I solder the other pieces on, I wanted to add some scarring using this file to the surface of this piece, seeing that I won't be able to make these lines once everything is soldered on. So speaking of soldering, I'm going to need to flux all the pieces to make sure that the solder will flow properly and everything will adhere together. So all I'm going to do is use some medium solder and put it on the backs of the gear pieces and the other brass piece. The flux should keep them on, and you just flip them over and place them on top of the heart piece. So once everything's soldered, make sure that all the parts of it are actually stuck down, and then you're going to need to pickle the piece to clean it off. Once it's out of the pickle, I'm going to do a quick cleanup of the whole thing again, and clean up any sharp edges from the two pieces, or pieces that just don't line up when we soldered them, just to make sure everything's uniform on the edges. Seeing that this is going to be a necklace, I need to make a bail for it. So I'm going to use some of the spare wire that I had in the scrap container, and I'm going to anneal it so I can flatten it out and then twist it so it'll have a nice pattern. Once the wire is completely twisted, it needs to be annealed once again and then finely pickled, because we're going to be forming it into the shape we need for the bail and then soldering it. So to make this bail, all I need to do is make a U shape with my wire. And to turn it into the bail, you just need to use some pliers and kind of just wrap it around the end of the pliers like this. And then you can pull the ends in a little bit more so everything's a little more tight. I'm just going to test fit it onto my piece and then adjust it accordingly. After that, we're going to need to solder the bail itself to itself at the 2 points where it meets, so it doesn't come apart and risk falling off. So just flux the whole thing and then use 2 pieces of hard solder for this, because we're going to have to solder it to the other piece with some easy solder since we've already used medium on the other piece. After pickling the piece, I'm going to file down the part that is going to come in contact with the heart piece so it has a smooth, clean surface, and it'll make it so there's no gaps between the two when we solder them, and that will make the solder flow through the entire area. So to solder both of these together, I'm just going to flux both pieces and then place the easy solder onto the bail and then put the heart piece on top of it, and while heating it, I'm going to apply pressure to it using some tweezers. And before I pickle the piece, I'm going to drill through any of the holes that got filled with solder when I was doing this, and there's now holes that are blocked by the bail on the back, so I'm just going to drill completely through it. So after pickling this piece and cleaning it up, it's time to actually start sewing it. You'll notice I already did one side. Don't worry about that because I'm going to be cutting it off because I ended up not liking it. To start off, I'm just going to make a circle in the end of the wire before putting it through so it doesn't pull out of the piece as I'm sewing it through the metal, and then I'll come back to it later and either solder it down or twist it together with another piece of the wire on the back so it'll never come off. So you're going to need pliers for this part because you're going to want to pull the metal pretty tight, and also when it's going through, it's going to want to wind up on itself and kink up basically. You're going to have to make sure it doesn't do that before it goes all the way down to the metal. And with thinner metal like this, there's a good chance that if you pull too hard or bend it too much, you can break it, and you have to cut all the wire out and re-sew it again, like I'm going to have to do now. To finish this off, I'm just going to cut a little longer of a tail and wrap it around the bail and crimp it down so it's not going to get snagged on anything, and that should hold this little piece of metal. So the reason why I'm cutting out the other side and redoing it is because I was one hole short and I didn't like that there was just one empty hole there. So what I did is I cut all the wire out and then added a new hole to finish on, so every hole will be filled with wire. It's also pretty much the same as the other side, besides a little more finicky because you have to go down and around a piece that is not solid and you have to make sure that it doesn't move out of place. One different thing about this side is it goes all the way around, so the beginning and the end meet one another, so I'm going to take both of those wires and twist them together and then solder them so they can't come out. To solder the two ends, I'm just going to flux both of them and then use some extra easy silver solder on them. So after doing all the soldering and pickling of it, we're going to clean it off with a steel wire wheel. So to patina this piece and get it to look how I want it to, I'm going to use a brass, bronze, and copper darkener from JAX Chemicals. They were kind enough to send this out to me, and I actually really like this over liver sulfur because, well, it doesn't smell, and it seems to work pretty quickly. I'll have a link in the description to their website if you're interested. All you need to do is brush it on, and then when it looks how you want it to, wash it off with some clean water and soap, and you're good to go. I'm going to take the steel wire wheel to it again to bring up some shine to it, but just lightly touch on places so it doesn't take off all the darkening effects. So for the very last thing, I am going to seal this piece using this. It was also provided by JAX Chemicals, and I will have a link in the description for it also. Well, that's about it. If you found this information helpful, feel free to leave a like on this video. If you have any questions or just want to say hi, go ahead and leave a comment. If you want to be alerted when I post new videos, subscribe to this channel. I try to post new videos every week. If you're looking for tools and materials that I don't list in the description of the video, feel free to head over to my website, gomeowcreations.com. There's a tab on the top of the page called Recommended Tools and Materials, and you should be able to find whatever you need in there. And if you can't find it there, just ask me and I will add it. Thank you for watching, and see you in my next video. Bye.